Somewhere in America right now, a dead man is eating breakfast. Not a ghost, not a metaphor, an actual guy with a tombstone. History is stuffed with these psychopaths, like the millionaire who beat his wife at his own funeral for not crying hard enough, the pirate who retired selling gunpowder to the people hunting him, and the congressman who invented his entire human existence and still got elected. 111 of the dumbest, slickest, most unhinged identity frauds in history are about to ruin your trust in everything. Smash subscribe before one of them steals your face too. And stick around because number 61 will make you question if anyone is actually who they say they are. 1. It's 1806 in Massachusetts, and a wildly rich businessman named Timothy Dexter decides he wants to know who actually liked him. So this absolute lunatic fakes his own death, plans a massive funeral, and hides behind a curtain to watch the show. Around 3,000 people show up to mourn him, eating his food and crying fake tears. Dexter peeks through the window and sees his wife barely sniffling. Furious, he storms out of hiding, grabs a cane, and starts beating her right there at his own funeral for not weeping hard enough. Guests fainted, neighbors gasped, and Dexter just laughed his head off. 2. Getting open heart surgery from a doctor who learned everything last Tuesday sounds insane, but that was Ferdinand Waldo de Mera during the Korean War. This American con artist stole a Canadian doctor's identity, joined the Royal Canadian Navy, and ended up on a warship full of wounded soldiers. With zero medical training, he cracked open chests and pulled out bullets while secretly skimming a surgery manual between patients. He performed 16 major operations and every single soldier lived. The Canadian Navy was so embarrassed when they found out they basically just shrugged and quietly sent him home. 3. Sarah Edmonds was a young Canadian woman in the 1800s who absolutely refused to marry the crusty old man her father picked out for her. So she did what any sensible runaway would do. She chopped her hair, slapped on some pants, and reinvented herself as a dude named Franklin Thompson. Then, she casually walked into a Union Army recruitment office during the Civil War and enlisted. Sarah fought in real battles, nursed wounded soldiers, and even snuck behind Confederate lines as a spy wearing disguises on top of her disguise. Nobody figured it out until she got malaria and quietly disappeared before doctors could investigate. 4. Ken Kesey wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which already tells you this guy had main character energy. After getting busted for marijuana possession in 1966, Ken decided prison was simply not on his vibe board. So he drove his truck to a steep California cliff, abandoned it dramatically, and scribbled a suicide note about how he just could not face society anymore. Cops searched the rocks below while Ken giggled his way down to Mexico. He hid out for months pretending to be dead, then casually strolled back into America. He served 5 whole months in jail. 5. Frank Abagnale Jr. was a teenage runaway who looked at the world and thought, why work when you can just lie real good? Before turning 22, this kid forged a Pan Am pilot license and flew across the country in the cockpit for free, sipping coffee with actual pilots. Then he pretended to be a pediatrician at a Georgia hospital, which is terrifying considering he could barely shave. He also faked being a Louisiana prosecutor and won real cases. The FBI chased him for years across multiple continents. Steven Spielberg eventually made a Leonardo DiCaprio movie about him, because of course he did. 6. Chief Buffalo Child. Long Lance strutted around 1920s Hollywood claiming to be a full-blooded Blackfoot chief who survived buffalo hunts and tribal warfare. He wrote a best-selling autobiography, starred in films, and charmed New York's high society with his rugged warrior tales. White elites absolutely ate it up, throwing him fancy parties and treating him like royalty. The problem was, Long Lance was actually a black man named Sylvester Long from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. When journalists started sniffing around his real background, the walls closed in fast. Rather than face exposure, he tragically ended his own life in 1932 at a friend's mansion. 7. David Friedland was a New Jersey state senator who got caught running a massive kickback scheme and faced serious prison time. So, in 1985, this absolute clown went scuba diving in the Bahamas and conveniently never resurfaced. His widow cried, the press mourned, and prosecutors closed the case assuming the sharks got him. Meanwhile, David was actually chilling in the Maldives running a wildly successful dive shop, teaching tourists how to spot tropical fish. He lived this aquatic dream life for 2 whole years before a vacationing American recognized him underwater. The FBI literally had to fly to the Indian Ocean to drag him home. 8. Christian Gerhardt's writer was a regular German immigrant who landed in America and decided his name simply was not luxurious enough. So he reinvented himself as Clark Rockefeller, casually pretending to be part of one of America's richest families. He fooled Wall Street firms, joined elite country clubs, and even convinced a Harvard-educated woman to marry him and have a child. For over a decade, nobody questioned a thing. He sipped martinis at yacht clubs while his wife paid all the bills. Things collapsed when he kidnapped his own daughter during a custody fight, and detectives discovered the Rockefeller family had never heard of him. 9. Forrest Carter wrote The Education of Little Tree, a beloved memoir about a sweet Cherokee boy raised by his wise grandparents in the mountains. American schools assigned it to kids, Oprah praised it, and readers wept over its gentle spiritual wisdom. Plot twist, Forrest Carter was actually Asa Earl Carter, a violent Alabama white supremacist who literally wrote segregation speeches for Governor George Wallace. He once led a Klan splinter group and attacked civil rights marchers. When journalists exposed him, fans absolutely refused to believe it. The book stayed on bestseller lists for years, while readers performed Olympic-level mental gymnastics defending it. 10. Arthur Bennett was a Marine staff sergeant who got busted for some genuinely disturbing crimes and decided court-martial sounded inconvenient. So in 1994, he grabbed a random corpse, dragged it into his trailer in North Carolina, and lit the whole thing on fire. Investigators found the charred body, assumed it was Arthur, and gave him a full military funeral with bagpipes and the works. His mama cried over a flag-draped coffin containing a complete stranger. Meanwhile, Arthur popped in colored contacts, dyed his hair, and started a brand new life under a fake name. He stayed dead for 10 entire years. 11. Gray Owl was the world's first celebrity environmentalist back in the 1930s, a rugged Apache warrior who lived in the Canadian woods writing tearjerker books about saving beavers. He toured England, giving sold-out lectures, met the royal family, and even charmed little Princess Elizabeth with stories of his tribe. Audiences absolutely melted over his deep wisdom and braided hair. Plot twist, Gray Owl was actually Archibald Bellany, a chubby English boy from Hastings who once worked at a chemist shop. He had dyed his skin with henna for decades. Reporters exposed him right after his death, and his fans collectively dropped their teacups in horror. 12. Raymond Grady Stansel was Florida's biggest marijuana smuggler in the 1970s, moving boatloads of weed like he owned the Gulf Coast. When the feds finally squeezed him in 1974, his lawyer announced Raymond had tragically drowned during a deep sea diving accident in Honduras. Authorities shrugged and closed the file. Meanwhile, Raymond was sipping cold beers in Australia, where he reinvented himself as a respected marine conservation expert running glass-bottom boat tours. He even won environmental awards for protecting coral reefs. Investigators only discovered the truth decades later, after Raymond had peacefully died of natural causes as a beloved Aussie eco-hero. 13. Cassie Chadwick was an Ohio housewife who looked at America's banking system in the early 1900s and basically said, "Hold my tea." She started telling everyone she was secretly the illegitimate daughter of steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie. She even staged a fake visit to his mansion, walking inside for 20 minutes while bankers watched from a carriage outside. That single performance unlocked millions in loans from drooling bankers who never bothered calling Andrew. Cassie blew the money on diamond necklaces, fancy gowns, and pianos she could not even play. The whole scheme collapsed when one banker finally picked up a phone, and Andrew was utterly baffled. 14. Jamake Highwater was a celebrated Native American author in the 1970s who won fancy grants, wrote PBS specials, and lectured universities about ancient Cherokee and Blackfeet wisdom. Critics praised his deep spiritual connection to indigenous culture, and he collected awards like a Pokemon trainer. The man had built his entire identity on being a sacred storyteller from the plains. Tiny problem, Jamake was actually Jackie Marks, born to an Orthodox Jewish family in Toledo, Ohio. A journalist exposed the whole thing in 1984, complete with his real childhood photos. Jamake just shrugged, refused to apologize, and kept writing books until he died. 15. Benny Wint was honeymooning on a Florida beach in 1989 when he suddenly decided his new marriage was simply not the vibe. So this absolute weirdo walked into the ocean and pretended to drown, leaving his fresh bride sobbing on the sand. Coast Guard searched for days while his family planned a funeral. Benny was actually hitchhiking north because he owed money to scary drug dealers and figured death was easier than confrontation. He lived under the fake name Bill Sweet for 20 whole years in North Carolina. Cops caught him during a routine traffic stop, and his daughter finally learned her dead daddy was alive. 16. James Hogue was a regular dude who looked at Princeton University and thought, that scholarship has my name on it. So he invented a tragic backstory as Alexi Indris Santana, a self-taught genius orphan who grew up alone in the Utah desert reading philosophy under the stars. Princeton admissions absolutely sobbed and offered him a full ride. James joined the elite track team, charmed professors, and lived in dorms for 2 years. Then a former classmate spotted him at a track meet and recognized his actual face. Turns out James had already pulled this scam at other universities because Ivy League schools never check anything. 17. Rachel Dolezal was the NAACP chapter president in Spokane, Washington, who passionately fought for civil rights and taught African American studies courses at the local university. She wore intricate braided hairstyles, darkened her skin with bronzer, and shared powerful stories about growing up Black in America. Everyone genuinely believed her for years. Then in 2015, a reporter cornered her on camera and asked if she was African American, and Rachel froze like a deer in headlights before sprinting away. Her actual white parents from Montana then released childhood photos showing a pale blonde girl. Rachel doubled down and insisted she was transracial, which the internet absolutely roasted. 18. Marcus Schrenker was an Indiana financial advisor who blew through his clients' retirement money, buying mansions and yachts. When the feds closed in during January 2009, he hatched the dumbest escape plan ever invented. He flew his private plane over Alabama, called air traffic control screaming about a windshield exploding, set the autopilot, and parachuted into a swamp. The plane crashed into a Florida neighborhood while Marcus pedaled away on a hidden motorcycle stashed in advance. Cops tracked him to a campground 2 days later, where he had slit his wrists in a tent. He survived and got 10 years in federal prison. 19. David Hampton was a charming young drifter in 1980s New York who realized rich Manhattan liberals would do absolutely anything for celebrity-adjacent strangers. So he started knocking on penthouse doors claiming to be Sidney Poitier's son, looking sad and explaining he had been mugged in Central Park. Wealthy families immediately fed him lobster dinners, gave him cash, and let him sleep in their guest rooms. He even charmed his way into the homes of Calvin Klein executives and famous journalists. The whole scheme inspired the play and movie 6 Degrees of Separation. David basically conned half of Park Avenue using nothing but vibes and good acting. 20. James Lafayette was an enslaved man in Virginia during the Revolutionary War who pulled off one of history's smoothest double-agent missions. He pretended to escape to the British side, telling Lord Cornwallis he wanted to spy on the pesky Americans for the crown. The British absolutely trusted him and let him roam freely through their camps. Meanwhile, James was actually working for George Washington, feeding him every juicy detail about British troop movements. His intel directly helped win the decisive Battle of Yorktown. After the war, he politely asked Virginia for his freedom, which they granted, and he proudly took the name Lafayette. 21. John Stonehouse was a British politician with shady ties to Czech intelligence who decided his life needed a complete reboot in 1974. So he flew to Miami Beach, neatly folded his clothes on the sand, and walked into the Atlantic Ocean pretending to drown. His wife back in London sobbed on television while obituaries praised his political career. Meanwhile, John had already grabbed a fake passport under a dead constituent's name and flown to Australia to start over with his secretary mistress. Aussie cops arrested him weeks later thinking he was the missing Lord Lucan. John actually seemed disappointed they did not recognize his own celebrity face. 22. Joseph Cafasso appeared on Fox News constantly during the early 2000s as a tough-talking special forces analyst, breaking down military operations with chest-puffing authority. Producers introduced him as a decorated Green Beret veteran with mysterious classified missions in his past. Viewers absolutely loved his rugged warrior energy and gravelly war stories. The teeny-tiny problem was Joseph had actually served exactly 44 days in the regular army before getting discharged for being completely unfit. He had never seen combat or even finished basic training. When journalists exposed him, Fox quietly deleted his segments and pretended the whole thing never happened. 23. James Barry was a top military surgeon in the British Army during the 1800s, who performed one of the first successful cesarean sections in history and revolutionized battlefield medicine. He had a fiery temper, dueled fellow officers, and even argued with Florence Nightingale herself in Crimea. Everyone respected the tiny, grumpy surgeon for over 40 years of distinguished service. After James died in 1865, the woman preparing the body made a shocking discovery. James was biologically female and had clearly given birth at some point in life. The British Army was so embarrassed, they sealed all the records for 100 entire years. 24. Samuel Israel III was a Wall Street hedge fund manager who scammed investors out of $450 million running a fake fund called Bayou Group. Facing 20 years in prison in 2008, he parked his SUV on a bridge over the Hudson River and wrote the words, "Suicide is painless" across the dust on his hood. Cops searched the river for days while Samuel was actually living in a Massachusetts RV park eating canned soup. His own mother eventually saw the case on America's Most Wanted and basically dragged him to the police station. Samuel had even faked his death using cheesy song lyrics. 25. George Dupree returned to Canada after World War II with absolutely jaw-dropping stories about parachuting into Nazi-occupied France as a secret agent, getting tortured by the Gestapo, and rescuing downed Allied pilots through the resistance. He wrote a best-selling book called The Man Who Wouldn't Talk, toured America giving sold-out lectures, and even appeared on Reader's Digest as a war hero. Schools invited him to inspire children with his bravery. Tiny issue, George had spent the entire war safely stationed in England doing absolutely nothing dangerous. When journalists exposed him in 1953, George cried and apologized, blaming the publisher for embellishing. 26. George Salmanazar showed up in early 1700s London, claiming to be the very first visitor from the exotic island of Formosa, known today as Taiwan. He invented an entire fake language with its own alphabet, drew detailed maps of imaginary cities, and casually told dinner parties about how Formosans sacrificed 18,000 boys to their gods every year. He even ate raw meat at fancy dinners to seem authentically barbaric. Oxford University hired him to teach the fake language to actual students. He kept the scam going for decades before finally confessing in a deathbed memoir that the whole thing was beautiful nonsense. 27. Patrick McDermott was Olivia Newton-John's longtime boyfriend who hopped on a fishing boat off the California coast in 2005 and simply vanished into thin air. Olivia was devastated, search crews scoured the Pacific, and tabloids buzzed with theories about sharks, suicide, and Mexican cartels. The case became a celebrity mystery for years. Private investigators eventually tracked Patrick to a tiny Mexican beach town where he was happily living under a fake name, dating a local woman, and avoiding $300,000 in child support payments. He was photographed alive and clearly enjoying margaritas. He has refused to come home ever since. 28. Frank Dux is the martial artist whose ridiculous life story inspired the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie Bloodsport, which American teenagers in the 1980s absolutely worshipped. Frank claimed he won a secret underground tournament called the Kumite in the Bahamas by knocking out 300 opponents. He also said the CIA hired him for top-secret Black Ops missions across multiple continents. The Los Angeles Times investigated his claims in 1988 and found absolutely zero evidence anywhere. His military records showed nothing special, and the Kumite tournament never existed. Frank still insists everything is real, blaming classified government cover-ups for the missing proof. 29. Korla Pandit was a glamorous television star in 1950s California who wore a sparkling jeweled turban while playing the organ on a hit show called Adventures in Music. He never spoke a single word on camera, just stared mysteriously into the lens with his hypnotic eyes. Hollywood housewives swooned over the exotic mystic from New Delhi who supposedly studied music in ancient Indian temples. Plot twist, Korla was actually John Rowland Redd, a black man born in Columbia, Missouri who realized in 1950s America would never let a black organist become famous. So he wrapped a turban around his head and absolutely fooled everyone for decades. 30. Alan Abel was a professional hoaxer who spent his entire life pranking American media just for the pure chaotic joy of it. His greatest masterpiece happened on New Year's Day 1980 when he faked dropping dead at a Sun Valley ski resort. His grieving widow called the New York Times, which published a massive obituary celebrating his career. Alan then called a press conference the next day, walked into the room very much alive, and laughed at every reporter present. The Times editors absolutely lost their minds with rage. Alan considered reading his own glowing obituary the single greatest creative achievement of his entire weird life. 31. Joseph Ellis was a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian at Mount Holyoke College who wrote best-selling books about America's founding fathers. Students absolutely adored his lectures because he would tear up describing his combat tours in Vietnam, where he supposedly served as a paratrooper before joining the anti-war movement. The man wove his fake war trauma into discussions about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington for years. The Boston Globe exposed him in 2001, revealing Joseph had actually spent the Vietnam War safely teaching history at West Point with a student deferment. He never fought anywhere. Mount Holyoke suspended him without pay, and his students felt completely betrayed. 32. Mary Baker was a poor English cobbler's daughter who washed up in a tiny English village in 1817, wearing a strange turban and babbling in complete gibberish. She drew weird symbols, refused regular food, and acted absolutely bonkers. Local nobility decided she must be Princess Caribou of Javasu, kidnapped by pirates from a faraway Pacific kingdom. They threw her fancy parties, dressed her in silk, and treated her like exotic royalty. American newspapers reported the story breathlessly. A boarding house owner eventually recognized Mary as a regular servant girl. She was so charming about the whole hoax that wealthy admirers actually paid her passage to Philadelphia. 33. Connie Franklin was an Arkansas drifter who supposedly got murdered by 5 men during a brutal Ozark Mountains attack in 1929. Witnesses claimed they saw the killers beat Connie senseless, slit his throat, and burn his body in a campfire. Local prosecutors arrested all 5 suspects and prepared the murder trial of the century. Then, halfway through the proceedings, Connie himself casually strolled into the courtroom alive and well, asking what all the fuss was about. The jury could not exactly convict men of killing someone currently sitting in the gallery. All 5 defendants walked free. Connie never explained where he had been hiding for months. 34. Jesse Macbeth became a darling of the anti-war movement in 2006 when he released a heartbreaking video claiming to be a traumatized Army Ranger who witnessed American troops massacring Iraqi civilians. Liberal blogs shared his testimony millions of times, and major news outlets booked him for tearful interviews. Jesse spoke about beheading prisoners and slaughtering families inside mosques. The military quickly checked his records and found out Jesse had washed out of basic training after 44 days. He had never deployed anywhere, never fired a weapon in combat, and bought his Ranger uniform on eBay. Jesse pleaded guilty to fraud and got prison time. 35. Albert Cashier was a tiny Irish immigrant who enlisted in the Illinois Infantry during the Civil War and fought bravely in over 40 battles, including the brutal siege of Vicksburg. Albert was quiet, hard-working, and slept fully clothed away from the other soldiers. After the war, he collected a soldier's pension, worked as a farmhand, and lived for 50 more years as a respected veteran in his community. In 1911, a car accident landed Albert in a hospital, where doctors discovered he was biologically Jenny Hodgers. The Army considered revoking his pension, but eventually let him keep it because his service was undeniably legit. 36. Michael Hand was an ex-Green Beret who helped build the shady Nugan Hand Bank, a wild operation that laundered CIA money, drug profits, and dictator funds across Asia and Australia. When his partner mysteriously died in 1980 and investigators started circling, Michael calmly faked his own dramatic suicide and vanished into thin air. The Australian government searched for him for over 3 decades, completely empty-handed. Investigative journalists finally tracked him down in 2015, living quietly in Idaho, under the name Michael John Fuller, working as a survival gear salesman. He was 83 years old and still refused to answer any questions. 37. Santa Kimis was a master con artist who roamed America with her creepy son Kenny, pulling truly insane scams across decades. Her specialty was identifying wealthy elderly people who lived alone, forging their signatures, and quietly stealing their multi-million-dollar properties out from under them. She would impersonate the actual homeowners at title offices, sometimes wearing wigs and fake jewelry. The whole grift went catastrophic in 1998 when Sante and Kenny murdered a Manhattan socialite to steal her townhouse. They forgot one tiny detail: you need an actual body to forge real estate paperwork. Cops arrested them within weeks, and both got life sentences. 38. Rochester Sneath was the imaginary headmaster of a fictional English boarding school invented by a bored Cambridge student named Humphrey Berkeley in 1948. Humphrey started writing absolutely unhinged letters to actual world leaders, pretending to be Sneath, asking serious educational questions like whether he could borrow elephants from circuses for a school parade. He demanded advice from the Prime Minister on hiring policies and asked the BBC to broadcast directly into his fake assembly hall. Real officials wrote back with completely earnest replies, totally fooled. When the prank was exposed, Cambridge actually expelled Humphrey for the disrespect. He later became a real member of Parliament. 39. Philip Cesarigo was a British soldier with mediocre military experience who blew himself up with a car bomb in Croatia in 1991. Or at least that is what everyone believed for years. He had actually faked the explosion using a random corpse and slipped away to reinvent himself as Tom Carew, an elite SAS commando. Tom wrote a best-selling memoir called Jihad about secret missions in Afghanistan, charmed British television, and lectured packed audiences about elite warfare. Journalists exposed him in 2008 after noticing inconsistencies in his stories. Philip fled to Belgium, where he was found dead in a freezing garage shortly afterward. 40. Stephen Glass was a charming young journalist at the New Republic in the 1990s who wrote absolutely electric stories filled with vivid quotes, colorful characters, and shocking scenes from inside America's weirdest subcultures. Editors loved him, readers obsessed over his work, and rival magazines tried to poach him constantly. Then, in 1998, a Forbes reporter tried to follow up on Stephen's article about teenage hackers and discovered every single detail was completely made up. Stephen had invented fake websites, fake phone numbers, and even fake business cards to fool fact-checkers. 27 of his 41 articles turned out to be partly or entirely fabricated. 41. J.S.G. Boggs was an American artist with the absolute audacity to draw his own fake $100 bills by hand, and then try spending them at real restaurants. He would order an expensive meal, hand the waiter his beautiful artwork, and politely explain that the drawing itself was worth face value as art. Shockingly, many restaurants actually accepted his hand-drawn money and gave him real change. The Secret Service raided his studio multiple times, accusing him of counterfeiting. Boggs argued his bills were obviously art because they were only printed on one side. American juries actually agreed with him, and he kept doing it for decades. 42. Jerry Balasag was a professional wrestler turned shady con artist who got mixed up in serious credit card fraud and decided prison was simply not his aesthetic. So in 1978, he traveled to Guyana and conveniently faked dying during the infamous Jonestown Massacre, where over 900 cult members drank poisoned punch. Investigators added Jerry to the death list and closed his fraud case forever. Meanwhile, Jerry was actually living quietly in Washington state under a brand new identity, running small businesses for 2 whole decades. A routine fingerprint check finally caught him in 1989. Jerry was reportedly furious that anyone bothered checking corpses that thoroughly. 43. Brian Dennehy was the beloved American actor who starred in movies like Cocoon, Tommy Boy, and First Blood, opposite Sylvester Stallone. For decades, he told interviewers heartbreaking stories about getting wounded by shrapnel during brutal combat in Vietnam, sometimes tearing up while describing fallen brothers. Talk show hosts ate it up, and audiences respected him deeply as a tough war veteran. The Chicago Tribune investigated his record in 1989 and discovered Bryan had actually served peacefully in Okinawa, Japan, doing routine Marine duties with zero combat. He apologized publicly, blamed his ego, and admitted he just wanted to seem more interesting at Hollywood parties. 44. Billy Tipton was one of the smoothest jazz pianists in mid-century America, leading his own popular trio that toured nightclubs across the western states for decades. He married multiple women, adopted 3 sons, and was beloved as a hard-working family man who just happened to be a little private about doctor visits. Billy avoided hospitals his entire life, claiming old injuries made medical exams painful. When he collapsed, dying at home in 1989, the paramedics made a wild discovery. Billy was biologically female and had hidden it perfectly for over 50 years. His own adopted sons had absolutely no clue and were completely speechless on national television. 45. Lord Lucan was a posh British aristocrat who allegedly bashed his children's nanny to death in 1974, thinking she was his wife, then immediately vanished off the face of the earth. Scotland Yard searched everywhere while London tabloids printed wild theories every single week. Sightings poured in from across the world, but one truly weird rumor placed Lord Lucan living quietly inside an American hippie commune in California, growing his hair long and meditating. Other tipsters swore he was farming in Australia or hiding in Africa. The British government officially declared him dead in 1999. His son still gets random Lucan sightings, emailed from American tourists. 46. Jason Blair was a rising star reporter at the New York Times in the early 2000s who pumped out absolutely electric national stories from supposedly faraway crime scenes and military bases. He filed dispatches from Texas, West Virginia, and Maryland with vivid eyewitness details that made readers feel like they were standing right there. Tiny problem. Jason was actually writing every single article from his cozy Brooklyn apartment couch using internet research and pure imagination. He invented fake interviews and stole quotes from other newspapers. The Times exposed him in 2003 after a Texas reporter recognized her own stolen words. 2 top editors resigned in shame. 47. Charlie Parkhurst was the toughest stagecoach driver in California during the gold rush era, hauling passengers and gold across treacherous mountain roads while fending off bandits. Charlie chewed tobacco, drank whiskey, lost an eye to an angry horse, and was known as One-Eyed Charlie to every grateful traveler in the territory. Charlie even cast a vote in the 1868 presidential election, which was completely illegal because Charlie was actually biologically female. Nobody figured it out until Charlie died in 1879, and the Undertaker made the shocking discovery. Charlie had basically lived as a man for 60 years without a single neighbor suspecting anything. 48. John Cochrane was a struggling 19th century American merchant, drowning in debt with angry creditors banging on his door every single morning. So this absolute genius cooked up a wild scheme involving his horse carriage, some scorched wood, and a thunderstorm. He staged the whole scene to look like a deadly lightning strike had vaporized him mid-journey. Neighbors found the burned wreckage with scattered personal effects and assumed poor John had been electrified by an angry sky god. They mourned him properly while John was already galloping toward the American frontier on a fresh horse. He started a brand new life out west without a single dollar of debt. 49. Friedrich Wilhelm Voigt was a German shoemaker who walked into a costume shop in 1906, bought himself a fancy military captain's uniform, and decided to test how much authority a costume could buy. He marched up to a squad of real Prussian soldiers near Berlin, barked orders like he owned them, and the soldiers actually obeyed without question. He then led them straight into the town hall of Köpenick, arrested the confused mayor, and walked out with 4,000 marks from the town treasury. The whole world laughed when the truth came out. The Kaiser was so amused he actually pardoned Friedrich. 50. Lucy Brewer claimed in her wildly popular memoir that she became the very first woman to serve in the United States Marine Corps during the War of 1812 by disguising herself as a strapping young man named George Baker. She supposedly fought aboard the legendary USS Constitution during epic naval battles against British warships, firing cannons and dodging musket balls. Her book sold like crazy in early America and inspired patriotic plays. The tiny problem is historians eventually realized Lucy Brewer almost certainly never existed at all. The memoir was probably written by a sneaky Boston publisher trying to make easy money off war fever. 51. Amy Semple McPherson was a massive evangelist celebrity in 1920s Los Angeles, packing her giant Angelus temple with thousands of weeping worshippers every Sunday. In May 1926, she vanished during a swim at Venice Beach and was presumed drowned by grieving fans. Her devastated mother organized a heartbroken funeral attended by huge crowds. 5 weeks later, Amy staggered out of the Mexican desert claiming kidnappers had drugged her and dragged her to a remote shack. The strange thing was that her shoes looked spotless and her hair appeared freshly styled. Reporters strongly suspected she had run off with her married sound engineer for a secret romantic getaway. 52. George Santos was a charming political newcomer who won a New York congressional seat in 2022 by inventing the most ridiculous resume in modern American politics. He told voters he was a Goldman Sachs superstar and a college volleyball champion who beat Harvard in tournaments. He also claimed to be a Holocaust survivor's grandson and a Broadway producer for Spider-Man: Turn Off the Dark. Then, reporters started checking his background, and absolutely nothing turned out to be true at all. He had never attended that college or worked at those banks. Congress expelled him in 2023, making him only the 6th member ever kicked out. 53. Harry de Mella was a broke German con artist wandering across the country in 1926 when he noticed something curious about his face. He looked surprisingly similar to the exiled grandson of the former Kaiser Wilhelm. So he started dropping royal hints inside fancy hotels, and elite Germans absolutely lost their minds with excitement. They threw him lavish parties and gave him free luxury suites everywhere he traveled. Wealthy aristocrats begged for his autograph and lent him expensive cars without question. The whole scam ran for 6 months before police finally caught him at a movie theater. Harry wrote a best-selling memoir from prison called The Sham Prince. 54. Thomas Dunton was a struggling pioneer in the early American frontier who got crushed under mountains of business debt. Angry creditors were threatening to drag him into court every single morning. So this absolute lunatic decided his only escape route was faking his own scalping by Native Americans. He scattered torn clothing, fake blood, and his own hat across a quiet wooded trail outside town. Searchers found the gory display and assumed Thomas had met a horrific frontier end. His widow collected community sympathy, and his massive debts simply evaporated overnight. Meanwhile, Thomas had quietly slipped further west, where he started over in a brand new territory under a fresh name. 55. Anna Anderson appeared in a Berlin canal in 1920, refusing to speak a single word to anyone. Somebody decided she must be Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest daughter of the executed Russian Tsar Nicholas II. Anna kept the wild legend alive for 60 straight years across 2 continents. She charmed European nobility and American tabloids with vague memories of imperial palace life. Books were written, movies were made, and thousands of people genuinely believed her royal claims. She even moved to Virginia and married an eccentric history professor. After Anna died in 1984, DNA testing finally proved she was actually Franziska Szankowska, a missing Polish factory worker. 56. James Revis was a Missouri streetcar conductor who looked at the entire American Southwest and decided he wanted to own it. So in the 1880s, he forged elaborate Spanish colonial land grants for his greatest scam ever. He claimed his wife was descended from an imaginary Spanish baron, gifted 12 million acres of Arizona by the king. He aged the fake documents with tea and bribed clerks across 2 continents to file them. Railroads, mining companies, and entire towns actually paid him real rent for years. The Baron of Arizona collected millions before federal investigators cracked his forgeries in 1895. He served 6 years and died completely broke. 57. Charles Johnston was a 19th-century American trader who needed to escape his nagging wife and crumbling business. So he hatched a wild plan involving a corrupt dock doctor and a sailing schedule. He bribed the doctor to officially diagnose him with deadly yellow fever right before his boat sailed for New Orleans. The doctor told his wife the tragic news and recommended a sealed casket because of contagion risks. The grieving widow received a weighted empty box shipped back from the southern port. Meanwhile, Charles had slipped onto a different boat heading 3 states over. He married a brand new wife and started a completely separate family. 58. Frédéric Bourdin was a French con artist nicknamed the Chameleon, who pulled off something nobody should have believed for a second. In 1997, he convinced a grieving Texas family that he was their missing 13-year-old son, Nicholas Barkley. The kicker is that Frédéric was actually 23 years old, with brown eyes instead of blue. He spoke with a heavy French accent and looked absolutely nothing like the missing American kid. The family welcomed him home anyway without asking a single suspicious question. A sharp, private investigator finally exposed him months later. Some people now believe the family knew and used Frédéric to cover up dark secrets. 59. Major Taylor was a 19th-century American businessman who pulled off the most audacious double life in American history. He maintained 2 completely separate identities in the exact same city without anyone noticing for years. He had 2 different houses, 2 different wives, and 2 entirely different circles of friends. He worked normal hours under one name and slept at his other home under a second name. He fathered children with both wives and even attended different churches on Sundays. The whole synchronized performance only collapsed when one wife casually mentioned her husband to a neighbor. That neighbor happened to know the other Major Taylor personally. 60. William Henry Johnson was an early American miner who absolutely could not handle being a husband and father anymore. He decided faking his own death was simply easier than packing a bag and leaving town. So he scattered his pickaxe, lantern, and discarded boots inside an unstable mining shaft outside town. Then he triggered a small collapse before sneaking out through a hidden side tunnel. Rescuers spent 3 exhausting days digging through rubble looking for poor William's crushed body. His wife mourned him properly and collected a small payout from the mining company. Meanwhile, William was already deep in the western mountains living as a fur trapper under a different name. 61. Clifford Irving was a struggling American novelist in 1971 who came up with the most insane publishing scam in history. He told McGraw-Hill that reclusive billionaire Howard Hughes had personally chosen him to write an authorized autobiography. Howard Hughes had not spoken to the public in over a decade and lived hidden inside Las Vegas hotel rooms. Clifford forged handwritten letters from Hughes and pocketed a massive $750,000 advance from the publisher. Then Howard Hughes himself called a press conference from his bedroom, denouncing the whole thing as fake. Clifford served 17 months in federal prison and somehow became weirdly famous afterward. 62. Joseph Yellow Kid Weil was America's Golden Age con artist who lived his entire life cosplaying as a sophisticated international businessman. He wore tailored suits, smoked expensive cigars, and spoke perfect German to trick wealthy investors across the Midwest. His specialty was running fake mining stocks and phony real estate deals targeting greedy bankers. He pulled off over $8 million in scams during a 50-year career across America. Joseph genuinely believed his marks deserved getting fleeced because of their own greed. He famously bragged that he never robbed honest men, only crooks. The Yellow Kid eventually died broke and laughing in a Chicago nursing home. 63. William Taylor was an unlucky 1890s American merchant whose store was drowning in debt with creditors banging at his door. So he hatched a plan straight out of a cartoon to escape his crumbling life. He bought a fresh medical school cadaver from a shady doctor and dressed it carefully in his own clothes. Then he set his entire store on fire with the corpse stretched across the floor. Firefighters found the charred body and assumed poor William had died trying to save his business. His widow collected the insurance money and grieved appropriately. Meanwhile, William was already starting fresh in another state with a clean name. 64. Laura Albert was a 40-something New York woman who pulled off the wildest literary hoax of the early 2000s. She invented a fictional young writer named J.T. Leroy, a scarred teenage truck stop worker with a gender-fluid identity and tragic past. Laura wrote best-selling avant-garde novels under his name and faked phone interviews using a fake Southern accent. Hollywood celebrities like Madonna, Bono, and Winona Ryder absolutely adored JT Leroy and called him constantly. Laura even hired her sister-in-law to wear a wig and appear at public events. The whole illusion collapsed in 2006 when journalists exposed the entire ridiculous performance. 65. Mary Fields was a towering 6-foot-tall former enslaved woman who became one of the most legendary frontier characters in American history. She rolled cigars between her lips, drank whiskey with cowboys, and carried 2 revolvers on her hips at all times. She dressed in men's pants and brawled with anyone who disrespected her. In 1895, she became the second woman ever hired by the United States Postal Service. Stagecoach Mary delivered mail across the brutal Montana wilderness for years without missing a single day. Wolves, blizzards, and bandits could not stop her. She became a beloved local hero and was buried with full honors. 66. Frank Wright was an ambitious early American industrialist drowning in financial troubles who decided his only way out was the most theatrical death imaginable. So he organized a public hot air balloon demonstration over the open ocean in front of huge cheering crowds. Then he secretly released the empty wicker basket at the perfect dramatic moment. Spectators screamed as they watched the balloon disappear into the distant clouds with poor Frank presumably plummeting to his watery doom. The Coast Guard searched the waves for weeks but never found a single trace. Meanwhile, Frank had already relocated to the Pacific Northwest, where he quietly built a brand new business empire. 67. Manti Te'o was a star Notre Dame football linebacker in 2012 who captured America's heart with his tragic personal story. He told reporters his beloved girlfriend, Lenny Kekwa, had died of leukemia hours after his grandmother also passed away. He played through the grief and led his team to the national championship game with everyone weeping for him. Sports journalists wrote tearjerker articles and Sports Illustrated put him on the cover. The whole love story turned out to be a complete hoax, cooked up by a confused online prankster named Ronaya Tuiasosopo. Lenny Kekwa never existed at all. Monty was reportedly catfished for years. 68. Xu Peipu was a Chinese opera singer who pulled off the most bizarre romantic scam of the Cold War era. He convinced a French diplomat named Bernard Boursicot that he was secretly a woman forced to dress as a man for safety. The two became lovers, and Xu maintained the female persona for 20 straight years across multiple countries. He even presented a purchased baby and claimed Bernard was the proud father. Bernard never once suspected anything because they only had sex in complete darkness. French intelligence finally exposed Xu as both male and a spy. Bernard was so heartbroken he tried killing himself. 69. John Allen was a small-time American criminal in the 1960s who needed to disappear before prosecutors built their case against him. So he drove out to a rocky cliffside overlooking the Pacific Ocean on a stormy gray afternoon. He carefully folded his clothes and shoes into a neat pile on the edge of the rocks. Then he left a dramatic suicide note weighted down by a single stone for investigators to find. Police searched the crashing waves below for days but never recovered a body. The case was quietly closed as a tragic suicide. Meanwhile, John was already living under a brand new name in another state. 70. Krista Worthington was a Massachusetts heiress whose famous murder case in 2002 attracted a strange opportunist looking to score big. A clever trickster forged a complete fake lineage paper trail claiming to be a long-lost relative. He produced aged birth certificates, fabricated baptism records, and convincing genealogy charts going back generations. The con man strolled into the wealthy Cape Cod community, insisting he was the rightful heir to her historic estate. Local lawyers actually took him seriously for several months because his paperwork looked shockingly legitimate. Real family members eventually exposed him after noticing he could not name a single childhood memory. 71. Bill Richmond was born into slavery in colonial New York in 1763, but absolutely refused to let that define his future. A British general took notice of his fighting talent and brought him across the Atlantic to England as a free man. Bill reinvented himself completely as a polished gentleman wearing fine suits and quoting Shakespeare. He then became one of the most celebrated bare-knuckle boxers in British history. He fought legendary matches in front of dukes, earls, and even royal family members. Bill ran his own popular boxing academy in London for years. He eventually attended King George IV's coronation as an honored guest. 72. John Davis was a small-town Ohio politician in the 19th century who got caught running a massive corruption scheme. Federal investigators were closing in fast and prison looked absolutely inevitable. So this clown organized an elaborate public funeral complete with a beautiful polished coffin and weeping family members. The coffin itself was actually stuffed with heavy rocks instead of his body. Mourners cried. The local pastor delivered a tearful sermon, and the town buried the box with full honors. The whole community grieved together for weeks afterward. Meanwhile, John had already slipped quietly across state lines using a fresh identity. His scam stayed buried for decades. 73. Rosie Ruiz pulled off one of the most embarrassing sports scams in American history at the 1980 Boston Marathon. She crossed the finish line in a shocking record time and was crowned the female champion on live television. Race officials hung the laurel wreath around her neck, while cameras flashed everywhere. The problem was that Rosie barely sweated and looked completely fresh after supposedly running 26 miles. Other runners had no memory of seeing her anywhere on the course. Investigators figured out she had jumped into the crowd just half a mile before the finish line. The Boston Marathon officially stripped her title within days. 74. Princess Olive was a clever Englishwoman in the early 1800s who decided regular life simply was not glamorous enough. So she announced to high society that she was the secret legitimate daughter of the Duke of Cumberland and the true rightful Queen of England. American expatriates living in London absolutely lost their minds over her royal claims. She produced fake documents and dramatically named, dropped at every fancy dinner party. Wealthy admirers gave her gifts, money, and free rooms at the finest establishments across 2 continents. The whole performance lasted years before British courts finally rejected her case. Olive died broke, but completely convinced of her destiny. 75. Elijah Moore was a struggling Georgia merchant whose wagon business was collapsing faster than he could count his mounting debts. So he hatched the swampiest fake death plan in Southern history. He drove his wagon directly to the edge of a treacherous alligator-infested swamp and abandoned everything there. He scattered torn clothing, his bloody hat, and even his prized pocket watch across the muddy ground. Searchers assumed Elijah had been dragged into the murky water by hungry gators. His family mourned him, and his creditors gave up entirely. Meanwhile, Elijah was already in Texas living under a dead cousin's identity. He ran a quiet shop until old age. 76. The fake Rockefeller pilot was a slick American con artist who realized commercial aviation barely checked anyone's credentials back in the day. So he forged elaborate military service records claiming to be a retired Air Force hero. He even invented combat missions, classified clearances, and a fictional Rockefeller cousin who supposedly bankrolled his flying career. He talked his way into the cockpit of multiple commercial charter planes carrying actual wealthy passengers. He flew across multiple states using charm alone before anyone questioned anything. The whole scheme finally collapsed when a real veteran on board noticed his uniform badges were absolutely all wrong. He landed straight into federal custody. 77. Amalia Deems was a poor working-class immigrant woman who showed up in 19th century Pennsylvania with absolutely zero money but tons of confidence. So she invented the persona of a European countess displaced by political turmoil overseas. She practiced an aristocratic accent, learned royal etiquette, and adopted the dramatic name of the Countess of Pennsylvania. She walked into America's finest hotels and lived completely rent-free for 10 straight years. Wealthy admirers showered her with jewelry, dinners, and luxurious travel arrangements. Newspaper editors begged for interviews about European royalty. The whole charade quietly collapsed when a real European diplomat exposed her at a high society ball. 78. Captain Silas Vance was a Great Lakes shipping captain in the late 19th century who racked up massive commercial debts to suppliers and bankers. So he staged a catastrophic boiler explosion aboard an abandoned cargo boat floating empty out on Lake Erie. He rigged the explosion to look like a horrible accident that vaporized everyone aboard, including himself. The shipping company found burned wreckage and assumed Silas was atomized. His family mourned, and his creditors closed the books permanently. Meanwhile, Silas had already crossed the border into Canada under a brand new name. He quietly worked the Toronto docks for decades until natural causes finally caught up with him. 79. Booth Tarkington was a famous Pulitzer Prize-winning American novelist in the early 20th century who attracted some weird fans. One ambitious actor noticed he resembled Booth from a distance and decided to monetize that face. He started crashing high-end literary parties across the East Coast pretending to be the celebrated author himself. He autographed strangers' books with dramatic flourish and ate free gourmet meals at every event. Wealthy literary patrons invited him to their estates for entire weekends of fancy dinners. The whole impersonation lasted several months before the actual Booth Tarkington heard about his imposter. The fake Booth quietly vanished into theatrical obscurity afterward. 80. Sarah Remond was a brilliant Black American woman born free in Massachusetts in 1826, who completely refused to accept the limitations of pre-Civil War America. So she boldly moved to Italy and reinvented her entire life in a country that did not care about her race. She studied medicine in Florence and became a fully licensed European medical doctor. She practiced quietly in elite Italian circles for decades, posing as an independently wealthy, refined European professional. She treated wealthy patients across multiple countries and earned tremendous respect throughout her long career. Sarah lived comfortably until 1894, completely free from American racism. She died honored in Rome. 81. Henry Miller was a struggling 19th-century American railroad conductor whose life had collapsed in every possible direction at once. Tired of the misery, he came up with a simple but effective fake death plan. He carefully placed his pocket watch and folded coat beside a busy stretch of fast-moving train track outside town. Investigators discovered his personal effects the next morning and reached the grim assumption that poor Henry had stepped in front of a thundering locomotive. His family held a small empty casket funeral and quietly moved on with their lives. Meanwhile, Henry was already heading west to California to pan for gold under a fresh new name. 82. Adam Wheeler was a Delaware high school dropout who somehow conned his way directly into Harvard University in 2007 without breaking a sweat. He forged a stunning fake transcript claiming he had attended MIT and earned perfect SAT scores across every section imaginable. He even fabricated glowing recommendation letters from famous professors at other Ivy League schools across the country. Harvard accepted him without bothering to check a single document for accuracy. Adam then maintained straight A grades and joined elite academic clubs across campus. He even applied for prestigious Rhodes and Fulbright scholarships using more forged paperwork. A routine background check finally exposed the whole scam. 83. Jacques Dupre was a mysterious Mississippi riverboat gambler in the 19th century with one signature trademark at every poker table. He always wore a heavy black facial veil that covered his entire face during card games. To curious players, he spun a tragic tale about surviving a horrific steam boiler explosion that scarred his face beyond recognition. Wealthy Southern gentlemen pitied him deeply and lost massive sums of money to his calm gambling style. In reality, the veil itself was the entire scam working flawlessly. Jacques was actually a wanted fugitive from a different state hiding from federal marshals. The cloth disguise concealed him perfectly, until he vanished one foggy morning forever. 84. Gideon Wells was a wealthy Southern plantation owner during the antebellum period, drowning in enormous gambling debts and ugly family scandals. Looking for a permanent exit, he challenged a rival to a public duel at sunrise on a dramatic foggy hillside outside town. Onlookers watched in shock as Gideon took a bullet to the chest and collapsed dramatically onto the wet grass below. His seconds quickly carried the body away with great ceremony to spare his grieving family from witnessing it directly. The entire performance was completely staged using a fake blood squib and a sympathetic friend playing his rival. Gideon ran a small Missouri tavern peacefully for life. 85. Jonathan Wild reigned as the most famous lawman in 18th century London, and Americans absolutely worshipped him from across the Atlantic Ocean. Newspapers in Boston and Philadelphia regularly praised him as the greatest crime fighter who had ever lived. He personally arrested dozens of dangerous thieves and recovered stolen property for grateful, wealthy victims. Behind this heroic facade, Jonathan secretly ran the entire London underworld himself with terrifying precision. He organized every theft, fenced every stolen item, then arrested his own competitors to look like a hero. The whole double game lasted over a decade before the law finally caught him. He was publicly hanged before a cheering crowd. 86. Arthur Vance was a legendary Old West scout who guided wealthy hunting parties and railroad surveyors through dangerous frontier territory. Everyone around the campfire called him the Whispering Cowboy because he only spoke in soft, hushed tones to anyone nearby. Other cowboys assumed he had damaged his vocal cords during a Native American attack years earlier in some forgotten skirmish. Behind that whispered voice was a much sneakier secret nobody ever suspected. Arthur was actually a highly educated Boston aristocrat who had fled massive embezzlement charges back east. His refined upper-class accent would have given him away instantly. So he whispered for 40 straight years until peacefully dying alone. 87. Silas Claxon was a poor Appalachian mountaineer in the late 19th century who absolutely could not stand his nagging family anymore. Hiking deep into the foggy woods one chilly autumn morning, he carried his hunting rifle and a wild plan. He left the gun broken in half beside a bloody torn coat with scattered claw marks across nearby trees. His relatives reached the obvious conclusion that an angry black bear had attacked and devoured him completely. They held a small mountain funeral filled with hymns and homemade biscuits in his memory. Silas had already crossed 2 state lines on foot using hidden backcountry trails. He worked quietly as a stable hand afterward. 88. The 1912 Syndicate was a slick group of New York con artists who decided to weaponize the most famous American surname available at the time. Renting an enormous Manhattan mansion, they started loudly calling themselves close cousins of the wealthy Vanderbilt family. They wore expensive tailored suits and hired professional butlers to answer the giant front door whenever visitors arrived. Wall Street banks immediately rolled out the red carpet and extended them massive lines of credit without question. They cashed huge loans and ordered luxury yachts using nothing but their borrowed surname. After almost a year, real Vanderbilt attorneys started asking pointed questions. The syndicate vanished overnight with all the cash. 89. Gavin Blake was a popular 19th century street performer who played violin beautifully on busy American city corners. Wearing a black blindfold around his eyes, he tapped his way around with a tall wooden cane and humble smile. Generous passers-by tossed huge piles of coins into his battered hat every single day without hesitation. Over years of playing on his tragic blindness, Gavin made an absolute fortune from sympathetic city dwellers. One nosy neighbor finally peeked through his apartment window one evening just to check on him. She caught Gavin reading the newspaper perfectly under bright lamplight while sipping fresh coffee. His lucrative career evaporated within days as gossip spread. 90. George Lowry was a wealthy American industrialist who got tangled up in nasty business scandals and shady financial dealings back in 1902. Traveling to a quiet Cape Cod beach on a foggy autumn morning, he prepared his most theatrical exit yet. He carefully folded his expensive suit, polished leather shoes, and gold pocket watch into a neat pile on the cold sand. Local fishermen discovered the personal effects and assumed George had walked into the freezing Atlantic to drown himself peacefully. His widow received condolences from across New England and inherited the small amount of money that remained. George had already boarded a steamship to Argentina under a new name. 91. Martin Fletcher was a clever American mechanic in the early 20th century who noticed something fascinating about the famous Wright brothers craze. Realizing nobody actually knew what their cousins looked like, he started traveling across the country claiming to be a close family relative. He told everyone he had personally helped design the original Kitty Hawk flying machine alongside Orville and Wilbur themselves. Wealthy investors and aviation companies practically threw lucrative contracts at him without verifying a single detail. He pocketed huge sums consulting on airplane projects he understood nothing about. The whole scam unraveled when an actual Wright family member showed up to meet him at one event. 92. Jean Lafitte was the notorious New Orleans pirate who helped Andrew Jackson win the Battle of New Orleans against the British in 1815. After the war, he supposedly retired peacefully and eventually died somewhere in obscurity according to history books. Some researchers believe Gene actually faked his entire retirement and death to escape his bloody pirate past forever. Living under the alias John Lafferty, he allegedly settled quietly in Illinois as an unassuming gunpowder maker. Local townspeople thought he was just a strange old man with a thick French accent and mysterious past. He reportedly lived peacefully for decades, while history assumed the great pirate had vanished forever. 93. Calvin Broadus was a struggling mining speculator in the early American West, whose investors were ready to lynch him over massive losses. Heading deep into the brutal Death Valley desert one blazing summer afternoon, he carried his prepared escape kit. He left his empty canteen beside a bleak diary entry describing his hopeless thirst and impending dehydration death. Search parties searched the burning sand dunes for weeks, but never recovered any trace of poor Calvin. The investors gave up and assumed nature had handled their revenge for them. Calvin had already crossed into Mexico through a hidden trail and reinvented himself as a quiet merchant. He died wealthy and unrecognized decades later. 94. Ellen Higgins was a sharp-witted young Irish maid working in the lavish mansions of New York's elite Astor family during the Gilded Age. Watching the wealthy women parade around in their beautiful designer gowns, she hatched an ambitious scheme. She started quietly stealing expensive dresses, jewelry, and accessories from her employer's enormous closets one piece at a time. Then, she dressed up and crashed high society events, claiming to be a distant member of the Astor family herself. Wealthy bachelors competed for her attention and invited her to exclusive parties across the city. The whole performance ended when the actual Astor matriarch recognized her own gown at a gala. 95. Thomas Kane was a smooth-talking 19th-century American con man who realized religious people would donate generously to almost any cause. So he ordered some plain brown monk robes from a costume supplier and started calling himself Brother Francis from a fictional religious order. He traveled across early American towns collecting donations for an imaginary monastery he claimed to be building somewhere out west. Devout Christians enthusiastically emptied their wallets into his collection basket at every stop along his route. He even gave heartfelt sermons about charity and salvation to packed church halls. Thomas pocketed thousands of dollars over several years before quietly disappearing into private retirement. 96. William Red Hill was a famous Niagara Falls daredevil whose family had spent generations performing crazy stunts at the legendary waterfalls. According to one wild rumor, he staged an elaborate accidental fall right over the thundering Niagara edge during a routine demonstration. Witnesses watched in horror as he supposedly tumbled into the churning mist below and disappeared completely. Search crews scoured the treacherous rocks downstream for days, but never recovered his body anywhere. Local newspapers mourned the great daredevil and held memorial services in his honor. William had allegedly slipped quietly across the Canadian border using a hidden boat. He lived peacefully under an assumed name afterward. 97. Hiram Vance was a complete fraud who set up a thriving law practice in mid-19th century Illinois without any actual legal training whatsoever. His secret weapon was a wild story he told every single client he ever met. He claimed to have personally studied law directly under Abraham Lincoln himself before old Abe became president. Awestruck farmers and small business owners hired him by the dozens to handle their legal disputes and contracts. Hiram somehow argued and won dozens of real cases using nothing but charm and Lincoln's borrowed reputation. The whole scam finally collapsed when a real Lincoln associate visited town. Hiram was promptly run out of Illinois. 98. Marcus Jenkins was a Civil War veteran who returned home in 1865 with a wild plan to maximize his government pension forever. He immediately started pretending to be completely deaf from cannon fire damage suffered during the brutal Battle of Gettysburg. He maintained this fake disability act for over 30 straight years without breaking character even once around family. Pension officials regularly checked on him and increased his benefits because of his severe combat injuries. Marcus collected thousands of additional dollars while quietly enjoying every birdsong and conversation around him. His own wife eventually caught him singing along to a tune one quiet evening. The pension office was absolutely furious. 99. Ramon Guerra was a corrupt Texas rancher in the late 19th century, whose business empire was built entirely on stolen cattle and shady land deals. With federal investigators closing in fast, he staged the most elaborate ambush scene anyone had ever witnessed on his sprawling property. He scattered bullet casings, his own bloody coat, and his prized horse across the dusty trail leading toward Mexico. Lawmen arrived and assumed bandits had murdered him before stealing all his hidden assets. The investigation was quietly closed, and his death certificate was filed. Ramon had already crossed into Mexico carrying his entire fortune in heavy leather saddlebags. He retired wealthy. 100. Julian Vance was a smooth-talking American swindler in the late 19th century who absolutely understood the power of a famous endorsement. He spent months forging incredibly convincing letters supposedly written by steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie himself. The letters dramatically described Julian as a trusted personal business partner, deserving massive financial support and investment. He walked into prestigious Pittsburgh banks with the forged paperwork tucked under his arm. Bankers practically tripped over themselves handing him enormous loans without bothering to telegraph Carnegie for verification. Julian pocketed hundreds of thousands of dollars before quietly slipping out of town one weekend. Andrew Carnegie was reportedly furious when he learned about it. 101. Pierre Marteau arrived in early 19th century Boston as a broke French immigrant with nothing but a heavy accent and big dreams burning in his chest. Wealthy New England families absolutely loved European nobility, so he reinvented himself as an exiled Italian count, fleeing political turmoil overseas. Dramatic tales about lost ancestral castles and stolen family fortunes back in Tuscany rolled smoothly off his tongue at every gathering. Boston's elite families competed fiercely to host him at their lavish dinner parties and weekend retreats. For several years, he lived completely rent-free in luxurious mansions across the city. One quiet morning, Pierre simply vanished after seducing wealthy widows and borrowing fortunes he never repaid. 102. In 1922, New York real estate developer Walter Sterling watched his property empire collapse under massive secret debts and furious investors. Looking for a clean exit, he sailed his small private boat out into Long Island Sound on a calm summer afternoon. The vessel was left drifting empty with his neatly folded coat and pocket watch arranged on the wooden deck. Coast Guard searchers concluded poor Walter had fallen overboard and drowned in the deep, murky waters below. His widow collected sympathy from grieving neighbors across the wealthy Long Island community. Walter had actually boarded a westbound train heading toward California to start fresh under a completely different identity. 103. The booming auto industry of the early 20th century gave a sneaky American mechanic named Ethan Cross his greatest opportunity ever. Traveling between major American cities, he claimed to be Henry Ford's personal hand-picked automotive designer for top-secret luxury projects. Auto shop owners across the country practically begged him to consult on their businesses and review their daily operations. Handsome consulting fees flowed his way along with free access to entire workshops and parts inventories. Huge sums of money piled up while he offered completely worthless advice and stole engine designs. Henry Ford himself eventually learned about Ethan and threatened him with an immediate lawsuit. 104. Suffocating under the social pressures of 19th century London elite society, wealthy young British aristocrat Nigel Thorne snapped completely one day. Sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, he vanished into the wild American wilderness for 40 straight years afterward. A quiet mountain trapper persona became his new identity inside a tiny isolated cabin deep within the Rocky Mountains. Local frontier folks knew him simply as the Silent Trapper because he barely spoke to anyone passing through the area. His refined British accent stayed safely hidden behind decades of perfect silence and complete isolation. Nigel died peacefully in his cabin without anyone discovering his actual identity as a missing British noble. 105. Caught embezzling massive amounts of money from his unsuspecting employer, nervous 19th century American clerk Arthur Pendleton found himself out of options fast. Federal investigators were practically banging down his door, demanding immediate answers about the missing funds. Traveling to the edge of the dangerous Great Dismal Swamp on the Virginia and North Carolina border, he set his stage carefully. His horse was tied to a tree alongside a blood-stained letter describing his terrible despair and final intentions. Search parties searched the treacherous, murky waters for weeks and assumed Arthur had drowned in despair. He had actually crossed into the deep south using stolen identity papers. 106. Literary celebrity opened countless luxury doors for charming American con artist Samuel Brooks in the late 19th century. Showing up at fancy historic hotels, he claimed to be Mark Twain's long-lost personal literary editor from many years ago. Hotel managers practically fell over themselves, giving him the finest available suites completely free as a marketing opportunity. Samuel signed guest books with elaborate flourish while telling wild stories about editing Huckleberry Finn personally with Twain. Gourmet meals, expensive wines, and luxury accommodations across multiple states filled his days for several wonderful years. Mark Twain eventually heard the rumors and publicly denounced Samuel as a complete fraud in newspapers. 107. Years of backbreaking work in the California mountains had given poor Mateo Rico absolutely nothing valuable from the gold rush. Frustrated and broke, he hatched a wild plan involving a fake noble heritage and some borrowed Spanish phrases. He started telling everyone he was actually a wealthy, displaced Spanish aristocrat searching for adventure in the rugged American West. Wealthy California landowning families were absolutely charmed by his exotic European backstory and refined Spanish manners around women. He successfully married into one of the richest ranching families in Southern California through his complete fabrication. Mateo enjoyed luxurious landowner status for the rest of his comfortable life. 108. Drowning under unpaid debts and angry suppliers, Maine timber merchant Charles Vance saw his lumber business circling the drain in real time. Heading deep into the frozen northern woods, one brutal winter morning, he prepared his theatrical disappearance carefully. His expensive coat, leather boots, and a final farewell note were scattered dramatically across the snowy forest floor. Search parties assumed poor Charles had succumbed to deadly hypothermia, somewhere deep in the unforgiving wilderness. His family held a small empty casket service back in town and accepted condolences from neighbors. Charles was already sailing toward the warm, sunny Caribbean, using a fake identity and stolen cash. 109. One famous name was all it took for struggling American stage magician Julian Fletcher to completely transform his career. Loudly claiming to be Harry Houdini's only personally hand-trained apprentice from a secret private workshop became his entire pitch. Theater owners across the country immediately booked Julian for massive nationwide tours without bothering to verify any of his outrageous details. Audiences packed venues hoping to see what Houdini had supposedly taught his mysterious young apprentice behind closed doors. Julian performed mediocre tricks while telling wild backstage stories about his fictional time with the legend himself. Harry Houdini eventually heard and destroyed his career through one angry newspaper interview. 110. Regular auditions were absolutely beneath ambitious American aspiring actress Sonia Romanov, who reinvented herself completely in 1920s New York. She dreamed up a dazzling persona as an exiled member of the executed Russian royal family who had miraculously escaped the revolution. Draping herself in exotic silk garments and speaking with a thick Russian accent, she shared dramatic palace memories at every party. Wealthy Manhattan socialites absolutely worshipped her tragic royal backstory and competed to host her at exclusive cultural events. Newspapers wrote breathless features about the brave surviving princess now living happily in America. A real Russian émigré eventually exposed her at a glittering charity gala. 111. Massive business debts had spiraled completely out of control for wealthy 19th century American merchant Thomas Sterling by the late summer. So he booked passage on a luxurious transatlantic cruise ship, sailing toward Europe one foggy autumn evening. During a dark, stormy night out at sea, his coat and hat were secretly thrown over the railing into the churning waves below. The crew discovered his belongings the next morning and concluded poor Thomas had tragically fallen overboard during the violent storm. His widow collected sympathy, and his creditors finally gave up chasing his entire estate completely. Thomas had actually disembarked secretly at a quiet South American port. He lived peacefully under a different name afterward. And there you have it. 111 absolutely unhinged historical legends who faked their way through life and death with zero shame whatsoever. From scalping hoaxes to fake Russian princesses, these wild humans truly understood that confidence beats credentials every single time. If your jaw dropped even once during this chaos, smash that like button right now because the algorithm absolutely loves you. Hit subscribe to Dumb History so you never miss another batch of ridiculous facts your teacher definitely skipped. Drop a comment below telling me which faker shocked you the most, or which one you secretly respect. See you in the next dumb adventure.